The Vietnam War, a conflict taking place between 1955 and 1975, which saw the Soviet-backed Communist North Vietnamese combat the American-backed South Vietnamese to unify the fractured country in the wake of French colonial expulsion, and it just so happens to be my favourite war to study. Whilst the United States initially was only offering advisory military support, the nation was pulled fully into the conflict, with over 9 million American military personnel serving on active duty between 1961 and 1975. But despite this heavy commitment by them, the war was ultimately lost, with the United States pulling out of Vietnam in March of 1973, all Americans being out of the country by the end of April 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon falling shortly after to the Communists. Many mistakes were made during the course of the war in both military policy and the decisions made on the battlefield, and these, coupled with the Viet Cong tactics and opposition to the war at home, the United States ultimately would be forced to withdraw from the conflict. To understand why the United States lost the Vietnam War, it is critical to understand what winning would have entailed. The main American objective in Vietnam was principally to stop and contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, this meaning that the United States would assist however possible to defeat the communist forces of North Vietnam, and support the South in unifying the country under an anti-communist government. At the time, the United States was concerned about what was called the domino theory, that being that if one nation were to fall to communism, so too would the nations around it, and viewed the rising communist sentiments in Vietnam as a direct threat to the Western world if they became allied with the Soviet Union. This is where problems arose for the United States, as the South Vietnamese government was incredibly ineffective and unpopular with the people, and thus a communist takeover was becoming more and more of a threat. In its 20-year existence, the South Vietnamese government was the subject of several military coups and assassinations, while also fending off full-fledged revolution by communist sympathizers and suppressing religious groups at the same time. In a now declassified 1964 report by the United States Air Force Project RAND, the South Vietnamese government is described as having serious military and political weaknesses, despite large-scale American commitments to the country, citing the lack of effective government control of a large number of provinces, military ineptitude, and deep internal divisions. The report goes on to state that the North will continue to undermine the Southern government's ability and will to resist, along with harassing the US into withdrawing from the country. These problems for the South's government are a critical reason why the United States could not win this war. The United States cannot remain in Vietnam forever, and if the South Vietnamese government can't stand without direct American assistance, then the government will inevitably fall to the communists. This fact was known to the United States as early as 1963, then President Kennedy, just a few months before his untimely death, saying, "In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it. The people of Vietnam against the communists." Essentially, all the North Vietnamese had to do was wait for the US to become weary of war, and then could unify the country under their banner. Furthermore, another reason the United States could not win the Vietnam War was the organization and operation of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Vietnam is an incredibly difficult place to wage a conventional war. It's a narrow strip of land covered in mountains and dense forests, which made it ideal for the Viet Cong to wage guerrilla warfare instead. The main tactics employed by the Viet Cong were 1. Encircle point, strike reinforcements, which is to encircle a point in order to induce reinforcement and to wipe out the reinforcements on the way. 2. Block reinforcements, strike point, which is to concentrate a superior number of troops to engulf a smaller number of enemies, using a small force to hold the area to be passed through by the advancing American and South Vietnamese troops, and thus blocking the advance of reinforcements by delaying action so as to gain time to strike the target area. 3. Surprise attack from a distance. A sudden strike is made by a rapid concealed approach from one or more distant points. And 4. Mobile attack, involving an unexpected attack and precipitous pullout, as well as a flexibility in shifting the main point of attack. All of these tactics are intended to result in short, decisive engagements, to chip away at the Southern and American forces before a counterattack can be mounted, and due to the Viet Cong maintaining the initiative, utilizing mobility, and using accurate intelligence gathered by scouts, these guerrilla tactics were very successful. Their better knowledge of the jungle terrain also contributed heavily to their successes. The United States' response to these tactics were their search and destroy operations, along with attempting to wage a war of attrition, and the sustained aerial bombardment of North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. Search and destroy operations were intended to locate and neutralize Viet Cong forces in the countryside, various platoons and companies being sent out into the field from their fortified positions. However, these tactics were largely ineffective, soldiers being easy targets during these search and destroy operations, along with it becoming increasingly difficult to determine who was friendly and who was the enemy, due to poor intelligence reports. Also, the brutality some American forces inflicted upon the Vietnamese people during these operations pushed many to support the North, further damaging the strength of the Southern forces. The extensive use of draftees to fight the war would also become a point of contention, many being underprepared for the war they were to fight and not wanting to be there in the first place, creating tensions between soldiers and their leaders, impairing the military's ability to fight effectively. The bombings were just as ineffective as search and destroy operations and using draftees. Bombing campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder carried out sustained aerial bombings of North Vietnamese positions, with the US dropping over 7.5 million tons of bombs over the course of the war, and this became the largest aerial bombardment in history. These bombings were meant to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but were unproductive due to the quick repairs made by the Vietnamese. Furthermore, most of these bombings were inaccurate or absorbed by the thick jungle terrain, and the US didn't have the capacity to bomb the North sufficiently to force them to surrender, unless they wanted to risk nuclear conflict, which they almost did. The offensive capabilities of the US were also severely limited, the commander of American forces, General William Westmoreland, not being authorized to launch ground attacks against North Vietnam or the enemy bases in Laos and Cambodia. Despite all this, the US won most of the major conventional battles of the war, but the lack of tangible progress in their aftermath would continue to erode the Americans' will to fight. Thus, the United States' attempts at using more conventional tactics in Vietnam, along with hindrances due to military policy, limited their effectiveness against an army fighting in a very unorthodox way, leading to a lack of significant battlefield successes and contributing heavily to the loss of the war. While woes within the South Vietnamese government and the failures of conventional tactics on the battlefield both played large roles in the United States' loss in Vietnam, the opposition movement within America also contributed to it heavily. Originating on college campuses, the anti-war movement developed rapidly, with hundreds of thousands of people protesting the war by 1969, and incidents such as the Kent State Massacre turned popular opinion against the war and the government in general. Public figures such as then heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali openly opposed the war and refused to be drafted into the US Army, his conviction in federal court further fueling dissent and anti-war sentiments. Many popular bands at the time began creating anti-war anthems that became widespread across the country. Creedence Clearwater Revival with hits such as Fortunate Son and Run Through the Jungle, Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, and Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones, to name a few. These songs served to popularize anti-war ideas and would culminate in the iconic, and now infamous, Peace and Love Woodstock Festival in 1969. Along with this, the anti-war movement became tied into the civil rights causes and other activist movements of the 1960s and 70s, eventually spreading to the army itself, with soldiers refusing direct orders, printing underground anti-war newspapers, and organizing small-scale mutinies, crippling the ability of the army to function. The aforementioned use of draftees that mostly didn't want to be there, furthering anti-war sentiment amongst American troops in Vietnam. As public opinion towards the war soured, more leaks from the front lines and the government began to make their way to the press. The My Lai Massacre, revealed to the public in 1969, and the Pentagon Papers in 1971, highlighted the grim realities of the Vietnam War, and how even some in the government were beginning to lose faith in the endeavor. The media can shoulder quite a lot of blame for the loss of the war, the majority of news outlets covering the conflict painting it in a negative light, dampening public support, and by the end of 1972, 60% of the war-weary US felt that sending combat troops to Vietnam was a mistake. As well as this, the media's uncensored coverage of Vietnam provided valuable information about American forces and the areas in which they were operating to the enemy, giving an intelligence advantage to the North. The lack of confidence in the war and the government's handling of it, combined with the increasing popularity of the anti-war movement, forced a suspension of the draft in January 1973, and an end to US combat operations in Vietnam, severely damaging the United States' capacity to support the South. Therefore, the crippling of the US Army politically by the media and the anti-war movement contributed heavily to its eventual withdrawal from Vietnam. The loss of the Vietnam War is an incredibly complex topic with many moving parts. There is no single factor that caused the United States to withdraw from the conflict. It was a gradual process that took place over several years. Incompatible tactics, poor public support, and an ineffective South Vietnamese government all played a role in the loss of Vietnam. Vietnam became a key inflection point for the US military, with many changes being made to the whole body as a result of the lessons learned from the conflict. Between the withdrawal from Vietnam and Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, many changes were made to the US military to rectify the policy mistakes of Vietnam, improve their equipment, and return to their place as the world's most powerful military.